I actually saw like an ABC documentary like a week ago on like YouTube, and I thought it was ABC America. But then because it was like we're talking about this trailer park in Florida that like houses exclusively sex offenders. We do have like these really strict rules where you can't, like, if you're a sex offender, you like can't be within 2 miles, I think, of like anywhere where like a park or like a school or whatever. So it's like really hard for these people to find places to live. And I turn it on, it's just like Pervert Park. Like it's just like Australia. Like they're just like sensationalizing it, and they're like,
that was really good. You do a good Australian accent.
Like, should these people be allowed to live here? And I'm like, they're living in like a...
You know, he's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, or moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
How are we going?
Thanks, Matt, for asking. I'm so like every time the only time I ever get asked if how I'm feeling is when we're on these podcasts, and it makes me feel validated. It makes me feel
acknowledged,
well inside. It's all I need in my life, and I'm glad that you're there to support me.
Yeah,
you, Ruben.
How are you feeling, Matt?
I don't have any feelings anymore. They've been drained from me from like 30 plus years of life. So
don't say that, Matt. You're full of life. You're energetic. You're in the morning. You're crazy.
I'm drinking in the morning, yeah. All right. So today we have our special guest, River Page, contributing editor from Twink Revolution, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a great online magazine and podcast. I don't know if this is right, River, but it's self-described as Marxism with twink characteristics, right?
Well, that's on the website. I think that it might be. I'm still not sure if that's referring to the podcast, which I'm not on, or if it's referring to the magazine. That's pretty close though. Yeah. Although it's not like a gay magazine, which is very confusing for a lot of people, I think.
Heaven forbid we ever have something gay in the magazine. That would be not in America.
We just pretend that gay people don't exist. Really, there's like 2 articles about them.
It's not a gay magazine, but it is a faggot magazine. So
wow,
a very key distinction, I think. Is
there's a very gay tone, I think, to the writing.
So. Now, we probably don't have to gay-splain Marxism to Ruben, but do we need to gay-splain the concept of twinks? Do you know what a twink is, Ruben?
Look, I'm more than happy for you to explain this to me live on air. Like, I have a vague idea, but I'm very happy to be.
Well, we say Ruben is a twink, actually.
You swanked, honey. I'm sorry.
I can be whatever you want me to be. I'm very happy to fall into categories. I'm very happy to be essentialized.
I mean, it's ultimately a state of mind, Rubens. So if you want to be a twink, like, you can be a twink.
Thank you.
How would you describe a twink?
Like a hairless young gay man.
And usually twinks are kind of slender and stuff. I feel like this is common enough knowledge, though. We don't need to unpack that, do we?
No.
People know what twinks are, right?
We can.
Anyway.
There was twinks in the north of England in the 30s. That's what I got from this book.
Yeah. Anyway, go look up twink if you're not sure from our explanations. I think we've explained it quite well. So anyway, we got River on because not only do I think he's a great writer, which we will get to later, but I also think you're a fantastic social media poster. And the thing I like about you, River, is you always have good takes on Twitter and you always get into a lot of trouble for those same takes. Things have been a bit calmer on the timeline lately, but what was the last one you got into? Last sort of big dust up.
It's hard to even keep track, I think.
That's what I was thinking.
I think maybe some people got mad at me again for like saying that like Asians are like a wealthy minority in America, which is true, like generally speaking.
My God, that is just too controversial. Can you like wind that back? This is a family friendly podcast, bro.
Exactly. Yeah, I did a Yellow Peril I thought that was just when I fucked like Japanese twinks from the Navy base. And yeah, people got mad about that, and they were like, "Well, I know like a Hmong refugee." I'm like, "Okay, well, if you want to do the racial thing, I also know like I'm also white and grew up in a trailer park. I don't know what you say, or a trailer house." People, people get mad at me a lot. I haven't been posting like very seriously recently because I'm just kind of been a little over it. But I think I'll get back into it and give something, give people something to get mad about.
You have it in you. I believe in you.
Yeah. I just recorded something with Zach Langley Chichi, I'm So Popular, which is another great podcast, last night, and I'm sure there's a lot of spicy takes in there. I just can't really remember much. We talked about idol culture and like K-pop and J-pop and all of that.
Oh, that sounds really satanic.
And how it just, well, I mean, by the end of it, I was quoting from the Book of Revelation, if that tells you anything about like where things are going. But yeah.
So before we got sort of moved on, I just wanted to get like a sense of what's your intellectual and literary background, and like who or what do you like to read?
So I went to like a shitty like state school here in Florida. I like went to community college in Texas where I grew up, wound up moving down here, waiting tables on the beach for a while. And then I went to the University of West Florida, majored in international studies, which is as fake as it sounds.
Is it fake and gay though?
Yeah, it is. Because like one of the literally the reason I did it is like I was like I kind of want to study abroad, but I don't really feel like I can like justify the enormous expense because I was working like 2 or like 3 jobs, like trying to put myself through college, and I was like, well, if I do this, then I like have to. And so I'll like make myself like save money and like do it or whatever. And I did. And then I went to Uruguay and I didn't really like it. And I was like, well, I don't really like living abroad. I'm probably never going to work abroad or like anything like that. So it was kind of like a pointless thing, but I graduated and then got sort of pestered into applying to grad school. And so I'm in like a history master's program right now, which I may or may not finish. I'm kind of over it. But I read a lot when I was a kid, but it was mostly fiction. That was my actual original passion. I didn't want to be an essayist. I wanted to write fiction. My first couple of semesters of like community college, I was like, oh, well, I'm going to major in English and whatever. And then I just got to a point where I was like trying to write these stories and I could never quite finish them. And I felt like I couldn't quite say what I wanted to say. And I kind of just like freaked out and just like abandoned fiction writing, fiction reading for a long time. I've like recently picked it back up a little bit, reading at least. I haven't got back into writing it yet. Maybe one day I will, and I started getting into more reading nonfiction. I got interested in like some philosophy, different like Marxist writers and stuff. And that's kind of like the background that I come from. But when I was like really into literature, I did like Orwell. I like 1984 and stuff like that. I was a really big fan of Hawthorne when I was in high school. I read The Scarlet Letter like 3 times, which was psychotic to people because like that was like the book that you like had to read. And some people hated it, but I loved it. I liked a lot of the romantic writers, Shelley, as well, and some others. But yeah, that's kind of my sort of background. And then I got into some different modern British literature, like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, which is my favorite book. I have a signed copy of it, which people shit on because they didn't like the movie, but I actually thought the movie was brilliant in its own sort of self-contained way.
Actually, I think the movie is actually a masterpiece. Like because it's a masterpiece of adaptation too, because the book structure, this is a tangent, but we like tangents here. But the book structure, I don't think is translatable as it is into a film, but I think the Wachowskis like did this amazing job of making it make sense in cinema. It was so great. The editing is fucking amazing. Like the way that they juggle those different narratives.
Well, it's amazing. And it's, I've like showed the movie to people before, and funny enough, like the more educated the people seem to be, like people that I've showed this movie to, which has to be like half a dozen people at this time, the more they disliked it. But I remember showing like my just like like white trash, like drunk relatives this movie, and them just being like, I get it, and like crying. And just like I didn't have to explain, like, stop trying to follow the plot. You need to understand what the themes are. You need to understand like what this means, how this, this character art is being administered like through these different lives or through these different scenes and lives, and how these overarching narratives that just like keep sort of weaving through the whole story. And like I never had to explain that to these rednecks, because like they, in a way, at least like the ones I'm talking about, which are mostly my relatives, even though they're a little like buck wild, like we grew up in like a really religious area. You still have to go to fucking Sunday school in like a Baptist church or whatever, and they understand like symbolism and meaning and sort of like the inner threads of something that like may not present clearly as a coherent narrative. So I think that coming from that background actually probably helped my writing a bit, coming from a, kind of a religious background. But in any case, yeah, so Mitchell is great. Ian McEwen I really like. I liked Atonement, The Cement Garden, and of course, Carson McCullers, who got ripped off terribly by Harper Lee, a brilliant writer of like Southern fiction, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez too. I really liked the magical realism. I got really into that for a while too. I think that's a really cool thing. I wish somebody would, and I don't know, maybe I will maybe one day, but like try to incorporate like the sort of Southern Gothic tradition of like a Faulkner or like a Carson McCullers or something in with magical realism, because I think it would be very cool. Because if you grow up in like rural areas in the South, like I did, people, there is that kind of like rustic, like people talk about like ghosts and like talk about old family tradition. I mean, I grew up hearing stories about ancestors that lived 200 years ago, because you're still in the same piece of land that's been in the family for whatever, like the same 4 acres of like useless farmland, and like that's all that these people had, because until 2 generations ago they were illiterate. And so I think that you could really like bridge that gap and create something really cool.
Yeah, I would read the shit out of that. Cool. Well, what are we all drinking? I'm drinking really, really fucking cheap wine, because it's what my grandparents, who were working class, basically illiterate immigrants, used to drink, and it's fucking foul. It tastes like vinegar, but that's what I'm drinking. No, only me and River are drinking, I think. You guys have coffee. Aye! What is it?
I bought this specifically to drink this morning. I was trying to find a Northern English brew, but I settled for Irish because that was what it is at the bottle shop. It's Kilkenny. He said it was stout, but it tastes like stout.
What does it taste like?
Just like a beer. Anyway, it's like drinking a beer. But you know what? It's vaguely unthemed, so let's make it work.
Yeah, I went to the liquor store and I bought. I couldn't find. I wanted to find something like English at least, but I couldn't find anything besides like Tank. And I was like, well, I already have gin, so I'm gonna get this. I was like, what would like a middle class like commie wannabe? What would they drink? And I decided on this Due South caramel cream, which is like it's like a very there's like little things on the side.
Sounds like Starbucks beer.
Yeah. There's like little things on the side compelling me to drink fresh, drink local. Yeah, just very like simplistic, sleek design and all that shit. So,
and what's it taste like? Is it all right?
It's actually pretty good.
Okay.
So,
and my coffee is fantastic. So, if you're lucky, I do have dark ales in the fridge, which I might get to at some point in the second half.
Or you could just Irish up the coffee. You could just Irish it up.
I don't have any whiskey, so I can't Irish it up. Cool. And I'm pretty sure that Irish quote-unquote beer that Rio has seems a little bit sus, to be honest. I feel like we shouldn't be drinking Irish beer talking about British culture. Something's gone wrong, I think. Yeah.
I'm just going
to. You did a colonialism, Rio. I like Orwell, but for me, he's very much like, and stay with me on this. He's very much like David Foster Wallace for me. I know
I didn't know that was going. I'm glad I went there, though.
Yeah. I know that's a weird comparison, but like David Foster Wallace, Orwell is lauded for his fiction, right? Like he's most famous for 1984 and Animal Farm, but I actually think, like David Foster Wallace, he's actually a better essayist and polemicist, and he gets the cred for the fiction. I feel like nonfiction form just sort of allowed his mind to unfold in a far more interesting way than the fiction. To be honest, I find the novels kind of tedious. Like, I understand 1984's importance and all that sort of shit, but the style for me is just not there. It's too sort of meticulous and it's a bit of a slog.
You can say it. He's a shit fiction writer. I mean, he can't write a sentence basically in terms of a fictional sentence.
I wouldn't say he's shit. I would say it's.
I would.
Well, I would say that it's sort of serviceable, but the thing with fiction is that like all writers need to have something to say. And that includes fiction writers. But I feel like Orwell, and this is the same with David Foster Wallace's fiction, they have very specific points that are more suited for non-fiction than fiction. Fiction's a bit more ambivalent, you know, like, so even it gets to the point where even the fiction is sort of polemic, and I don't like that. So that's my views on Orwell in general. Sorry.
Orwell's fiction is both didactic and also doesn't have the same amount of nuance that his nonfiction writing has, which is interesting because it's like you can, you know, American conservatives can read 1984 and come away with the conclusion that Orwell is like one of them or something. And as they did, I believe it was, what's his name? National Review guy.
William Buckley?
William F. Buckley, yeah. Like wrote like a great review of like 1984, and apparently Orwell was like confused. But it's like, because he was like, you know, a conservative who was like doing a Red Scare thing and like called everything socialism. And you could like, I don't think that William F. Buckley could read like The Road to Wigan Pier and like recommend it to like readers of the National Review if he's, you know, trying to pursue the political project that he pursued, which is like a weird mix of economic conservatism and social conservatism. So that's kind of like the weird thing with Orwell's fiction to me, is that it misses on several different levels. But I will say that it was kind of like one of a good book to read when you're like 19 or 20 and like trying to come into some sort of political consciousness, if you're like interested in what the ideological disputes of that era were. If you have enough interest to be able to look at things beyond just like a surface level reading, which is what and like that actually like helped get me more interested in like the history of debate like on the left, because I took a class in college where we read 1984, and it was just at like a little community college, but this is like one of the best professors I ever had, and she was like, no, like he's not a conservative, he called himself a socialist his whole life, he just had a lot of problems with Stalin specifically and the socialist movement as it stood at the time. It just kind of depends on how you go at the book, I think, whether or not it's a useful.
I've never read 1984. I have read Animal Farm, but it was a long time ago. So I can't really comment on like the specifics of Orwell's style in that book. But I will say, like, Road to Wigan Pier is, at least for me personally, very effective. Like, you know, I remember reading Animal Farm, and what I do remember reading it is like thinking, oh, whatever he's talking about, it was bad. And like, you know, for someone who appears to have, you know, an intention, a purpose with his writing, this is probably just a long way of saying, I agree with you, Matt. It certainly comes across more in his fiction here.
Yeah, well, like his other non-fiction books are great. I really like Burmese Days and Down and Out in Paris and London. But also his shorter essays were really kind of formative for me, like Politics in the English Language and Why I Write. They were some of my favorites when I was younger. And they're kind of really punchy, and they sort of make their point with that lean and mean style that Orwell has. But I feel like that style he carries over into the fiction and it doesn't quite work. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't work. Like, and The Road to Wigan Pier as well, which we'll start talking about soon, it's actually not one of my favorites, but I think it's important because of the analysis he provides, especially in the second part, which I find hilarious and really insightful, and perhaps still relevant today.
I think maybe part of the fiction, and I think you're right that it's like, River, you're right in the fact that you like saying that it's like it's didactic, but also like too ambivalent as well. It's like weird mixture of these things, and like particularly Animal Farm. It's fine. There's something like inoffensive about it, or nothing offensive about it, I guess. And the same with 1984, like, but they're only really sort of useful now in terms of their like. I feel like you can get everything useful out of 1984 by looking at the Wikipedia article and seeing his like understanding of like different kinds of concepts, like newspeak and all these different terms, which have just sort of become banal in the way that they've just been assimilated by the culture, particularly in the last like 10, 15 years. But in terms of like a novel or in terms of a work of literature or work of art, they're kind of devoid of interesting content. Like you can, and I feel like you should not be able to say about a really great work of art that you can reduce it to a Wikipedia article and then get everything out of it. And I think, yeah, Orwell seems to be like that, which I feel like for some reason, I think there are parts of, again, when we talk about the road to Wikipedia, there are parts of this, I think particularly the first part of this book, which I would probably say the same thing about, that they don't really, the value of it I feel like is lost more on us today. But the second part, you get much more of a, I don't know, there's something more effective about the style, even if the style still seems a little bit almost too much to the point.
Right. And I think, when was this written before World War II?
Yeah, 1937.
This maybe is part of the reason why I found myself agreeing with Orwell and then also having profound disagreements with him on a number of points. I think, and just with like his body of work more generally, which a lot of people who I kind of associate with politically really hate Orwell because of his views on Stalin, which were in many ways like justified and also I think a bit over the top, especially the ones that came after World War II. Like in this book, I think he actually at one point directly compares Stalin to Mussolini, which, you know, I mean, American conservatives, even liberals do, but it's, you know, obviously like those people were on two different sides of the war. One of them liberated the death camps, the other person sent people to them. And so the reason that Western Marxists today have such a harsh view of Orwell is, one, because he was adopted posthumously by the right, by people like William F. Buckley for his fiction, and also because we're in like a stage where the Soviet Union is no longer there and we're all worse off for it, even in the West. I mean, even in the United States specifically, the United States has been in decline ever since the Soviet Union fell, and it's not a coincidence. There's no project anymore. Like the project of anti-communism in the United States, for all the horrors that it brought, at the very least kept the United States honest. We probably wouldn't have had a civil rights movement if every piece of Soviet propaganda didn't show, you know, black people hanging from trees. We probably would never have made the advancements in science and technology that we made. We probably never have gone into space. We probably would have never done all of the amazing achievements of like the post-war period if it hadn't been an endless desire to one of the Soviet Union. We probably would have never even done like the Great Society projects of the 1960s and 70s, which people see as an extension of the New Deal, was not an extension of the New Deal. It was actually like a pretty direct response to the Soviet Union and countries like Cuba pointing out correctly that there were huge segments of the United States that basically lived in third world conditions. My grandmother was born in 1954. Her family didn't have electricity until the 70s or running water. Her parents were illiterate. They've been in this country for 300 years. And programs in the Great Society project from the Johnson administration gave them electricity through the Rural Electrification Project, gave them running water, started giving out like scholarships, built massive infrastructure, which directly employed like people like my great-grandfather. They did all of these things to basically prove that capitalism was a morally superior system. And now there's no ideological competitor. And so we have nothing left. And I think like, and it kind of goes along with what Orwell says, is like a lot of these like sort of middle class Marxists don't actually want socialism really, or that they just like the idea of like sort of like being on top or whatever. And I can definitely see that in the United States among these sort of like middle class people, mostly in like the DSA and stuff, who are downwardly mobile. And they want there to be some sort of ideological competitor, because even if they lose, if they can force the point, I think maybe in the back of their minds, they know that like something will be done to help sort of reproduce the system that created their class en masse in the United States, which was an anti-communist project.
Yeah, I get what you mean, because like the triumph of whatever you want to call it, Fukuyama, end of history, liberalism, or whatever, it's been really interesting to see that triumph means that people, and I've mentioned this before, that there's always these invocations of kind of spectral enemies, like fascism, which is like a non-existent or very, very marginal ideology, or else it's sort of like diffuse things like racism, or like that's not an ideological competitor. It's just a thing that they oppose themselves to and don't really provide any kind of solutions to.
I like English cookery, English beer, French red wine, Spanish white wine, Indian tea, strong tobacco, coal fire, candlelight, and comfortable chairs.
Go on.
I dislike big towns, noise, the motor car, the radio, tinned food, and central heating.
Interestingly...
And modern furniture.
Quite.
I did really love this book, and I don't read nonfiction. I mean, I guess I do, but I read online articles. I don't read a lot of like a book length nonfiction. It was really, really fun to read a Vice article from 1937.
It's a long ass Vice article.
Vice article, but this just read so much like a Vice article, or Anthony Bourdain goes to the north of England. He hangs out with the poros. This is awful. What are we doing? I don't know why I did that accent, but I did. But it was like his personality comes out so strong. And I was reading this at the same time listening to the audiobook, which is narrated by Jeremy Northam, who... That is my housemates walking down the stairs. That's fine. He has this amazing affectation of Orwell's like snarky, sarcastic bitchiness. Yeah, it really, really felt like I felt like I was reading a periodical at the time. It really took me back. I think George Orwell's writing holds up so well for something that's 80 years old. I know you have a different opinion about this, Ruben, but I was so enraptured by the first half of this book. And even though I think we're all in agreement that the second part, holds more weight, kind of more...
Second part's the juicier part.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can draw so much that we can, that is super relevant now. Just as a travelogue, as a piece of a critiquable. He absolutely does like the common people thing, but he knows that's what he's doing. I really loved this piece of travelogue. I really did.
Yeah. I would agree. I kind of would agree that I prefer the second part. But the good thing about the first part, in terms of his style, is that he does the whole examining the working class from his kind of class position. But he's aware of that. He doesn't romanticize it or anything like that. Like, he is very self-aware as he is analyzing all this stuff in sometimes I think unnecessary detail. That's part of my critique of the first part. But I don't know. Maybe you guys would disagree.
Yeah, I think the thing for me was the detail, which I think I found it almost impossible not to speed read the first part. I just found that I think if I was reading it when it was published, then I probably would have found it more riveting or more interesting, partly because, I can imagine myself, in the 1930s, not particularly having that much of a detailed knowledge of how minds work, how the sort of, these class of people live and all that sort of stuff, which I would have found much more interesting, riveting. But today it's like, well, fine, I know all of this sort of already. So to read it again in just like really, really, really excruciating detail, just I don't know, it didn't really work for me that well.
Reading the first part, the conclusion that I came to is that he's possibly the most nuanced snob of the 20th century, and like I really appreciate that about him. Like he is a snob. I mean, like I would like recoil in horror about like the things that he would write about some of the people I grew up with, you know, like in like the sort of, which my family kind of eventually got out of for a while, at least, fingers crossed. But like the sort of like poor southern like white underclass, which is literally just descended from people that like the UK shipped over in droves. But he writes about it in a way like he's both snobbish, but he also understands like the humanity of his subjects, and like presents them as fully human in a way that I think is actually preferable to the sort of anthropological examinations of other underclasses. Like I think particularly about, you know, in the New Left in the United States, the way that some writers in the New Left would write about Black people, like the Black underclass, and how it was all very romanticized, and how they would like try to draw links like directly back to like the Congo or whatever for like whatever these people were doing. And it's just like viewing them as sort of like alien, you know, or like angelic, or both at the same time. Which is just as dehumanizing really as the sort of you know, racist writings or dog whistle sort of things where people just say, you know, here's all the problems with this community. And yeah, at the very least he acknowledges their humanity, and it felt like the people he talks about were real, like they're characters in his story, even though it is nonfiction, but they're well-rounded. They're not caricatures, exactly.
Yeah, I certainly have never found a landlord so sympathetic.
Right.
There's the in his first chapter, who are fucking awful people. It's I think it's such a fantastic opener to the book, where at the end of the chapter is like, ultimately these awful, awful, awful people are victims of the system too. And I really loved that kind of. And, you know, and then he obviously unpacks that over the course of the first half.
The other thing I would say about the first half as well is that this is probably a hot take. I'm probably reading too much into it, but the kind of slog of it, I think, reflects the kind of drudgery and despair of a lot of these coal mining towns that he's trying to get across to the reader, you know, like thinking about budgets and housing and how you're going to warm yourself and all this sort of stuff. It is sort of in that like detailing all of that stuff and going on for perhaps more than he has to reflects that kind of life that these people have. And like there's something to that, and maybe that the kind of that slog of the first part is part of it. That's the point in the style itself. I don't know.
I tend to agree with you there, and maybe this is like a postmodern reaction of mine, a meta-modern reaction, one might say. I recently rewatched again a favorite documentary of mine, Paris is Burning, and the parallels I was thinking is like Orwell. You know, I think the director of that film, whose name I am pulling up now,
Jenny Livingston,
was trying to get away. Thank you. Was perhaps trying to get away from this style of, you know, a documentary where, you know, you don't see her at all, and she doesn't want to be present in what she's doing. Whereas, you know, Orwell is like, this is my experience. I am inserting myself, one might say, like aggressively and incredibly, you know, problematically into these people's lives. But the thing about like Paris is Burning is that like Jenny Livingston is like a bougie New York film student, and her kind of touch on the film can like totally be read as, she's trying to make this objective film, but it is not objective at all. It's exploiting the lives of these destitute, poor, gay, trans, queer people, and it comes across as kind of insidious at times. Orwell is like, I'm being insidious. I have to be, because that's my only way of doing what I want to do. He doesn't kind of suffer from pretending. And I found that really, really refreshing almost. He's like, yep, I'm kind of doing these things that are a little bit fucked. I probably shouldn't be pretending to be a homeless person and panhandling, but I just kind of did it. And these are the things that I found out. You don't see that anymore. You don't see people who are willing to. He's willing to offend. He's willing to offend. He puts himself online and is willing to offend.
Shall we move? Is there anything more we want to say about part one, or shall we move on to the fun part, second part?
I do just want to pull my favorite quote from the first part because I did really like this part, and I feel like I say this a lot on this podcast, but it's just still so relevant to now. In that Leviticus, type chapter where he's talking about the prices of these awful fucking mold traps that people live in. He pulls out, this kind of idea of, which he goes further into in the second part, of the fat cat landlord versus the good communists. And he says, ideally, the worst type of landlord is a fat, wicked man, preferably a bishop, who is drawing an immense income from extortionate rents. Actually, it is a poor old woman who has invested her life's savings in 3 slum houses, inhabits one of them, and tries to live on the rent of the other 2, never in consequence having any money for repairs. And fuck me, the way that our property kind of market is run is predominantly by people like that. If it's not worse than it was now, yeah, it almost it was the same 80 years ago. We are still in that cycle of, what our fucking prime minister, our party, trying to be like, oh, everyone should get a house and everyone should be able to negative gear their house and everyone should be able to live off rent of other people. And it is the party line that your house should be a money-making venture. And it felt like a shock from the past to be like, this system is fucked. It does not work. You cannot make money off of people's, making people off of money this way, tricking people into thinking that it's the best thing to. Oh, that really, really kind of stuck with me. Anyway.
Yeah, I get what you mean, and I wanted to share a part that I found telling, where he says he's talking about the miners, and he's saying it is very much different for a member of the bourgeoisie, even such a down at heel member as am I. Even when I am on the verge of starvation, I have certain rights attaching to my bourgeois status. I do not earn much more than a miner earns, but at least I do get paid into my bank in a gentlemanly manner, and I can draw it out when I choose. And when my account is exhausted, the bank people are still passively polite. What I found interesting about that is not that there's, because of the specific incidents talked about, deposited directly in a bank, whatever, that doesn't matter anymore. But there is a consistency here where, especially now, we have so many members of the sort of downwardly mobile middle class millennial, which is the archetypical leftist now in America, who earns. Well, I mean, these people, there are professors at NYU who make less than garbage men, most of them probably. Or, there are people who, there's a sort of social prestige attached to the lower rungs of professional life. And that creates a sort of divide where you have people saying well, no, I am a member of the working class and I make even less than this plumber does. This plumber's self-employed, so technically that doesn't even make him a worker. He's a member of the bourgeoisie. You know what I mean? And it's like you don't understand. Like when Michael Lind wrote in American Affairs about horseshoe theory. I mean, I didn't agree with all of it, but he was right about some things. There definitely is, even in America, which has like I suppose a more fluid class culture than like the UK does, and especially did at this time. There is still like a pretty distinct way in which professional class people speak, the way that they see the world and the way that they relate to the working class. And a lot of it has more to do with the nature of the work than the pay or anything like that.
Yeah.
So.
And there's also I've encountered so many, because when I used to work in universities, I encountered so many people like, your downwardly mobile millennial who, is teaching a few classes as an adjunct or something like that, is making less than tradies by far, like garbos and carpenters and stuff. But always, not all of them, but many of them have an out, because so many of them are from quite well-off families. So their families will swoop in and sort of, so technically they are not making that much money, but they always have that backup plan. Whereas working class, this is what I found very funny as when I was at university, because I don't have that. My parents aren't rich. So I was like, if I didn't get work one semester, I couldn't just live off the largesse of my of my parents, So, and there's a lot of that, especially we're talking about universities now, but that's a kind of element to that class thing. Whenever anyone does the whole, it's an income-based thing. Well, class isn't reducible to income. Like, it's a big part of it, but it's not reducible to that, for specific jobs and stuff. And I think Orwell kind of understands that too.
And it's only become like more and more apparent today than it was like back then, where class really does not have that much to do with income at all really anymore, which is always like, I think it's like particularly like, I found it strange. And you find like in the second part of the book, to segue into the second part of the book.
Ruben loves to segue.
I love segues. Where he consistently talks about how there's so much talk about abolishing class distinctions without actually realizing or without actually putting in the effort to think about what that would actually mean in practice. And of course, the people who really want to abolish class distinctions are the middle class. And what Orwell sort of gets at here, and there's a really good quote which I don't have available to me, I might find it a bit later, where he talks about how what that really means is that the middle class want to abolish the upper class and the lower class. They want everyone to sort of be like them. They don't want the lower class. Like no one ever sort of says that, we'll abolish class distinctions, then we'll all be like the lower class, right? It's always that we all want to be like the middle class, right, to a certain extent. And then you get what I think is probably my favorite, the part of the book that actually sort of like opened out to me, and sort of I realized this is like, the second part of the book would probably be a lot better than the first part. So here's Orwell writing. Here you come to the real secret of class distinctions in the West. The real reason why a European of bourgeois upbringing, even when he calls himself a communist, cannot without a hard effort think of a working man as his equal. It is summed up in 4 frightful words, which people nowadays are chary of uttering, but which are bandied about quite freely in my childhood. The words were, the lower classes smell. And then further on down, you can have affection for a murderer or a sodomite. You cannot have affection for a man whose breath stinks. So I think which is sort of like, he's right though. Like he gets at the fact that like at the end of the day, what's kind of like humorous about I think it's like the same today, like the middle class, like particularly socialists, who are like always talking about wanting to improve the plight of the working class, even when the plight of the working class actually ends up earning more than they are in a lot of instances, is because they really want to abolish what the working class is. They want to abolish their diction. They want to abolish their culture, or they're sort of somewhat elitist or snobbish about their culture, which Orwell is as well, but he's much more honest about that. And he doesn't really want to, at the same time, get rid of like lower class cultural lower class ideas or anything like that. He wants to sort of like he wants to like incorporate that difference into the nature of socialism, or he wants to like provide a sort of, it wants socialism to be like not about like that. He wants it to be something more about like justice or liberty or something like that, or at least that should be the way that's framed going forward, which doesn't seem to be the case today, just as much as it didn't seem to be the case back then. But
Yeah,
and I'm curious too, and I'd be interested to hear if like it's same or different in Australia. But what you said about them wanting to like leftists, these downwardly mobile middle class leftists wanting to make inroads for the working class, which sometimes make more money than them. I feel like it's harder to like in the United States because a lot of these people have come to see the white working class as reactionary. They, because for a variety of reasons, the foremost being that like white poverty is associated with the South, for reasons that are both real and also stereotypical, but like rooted in a sort of truth of reality. It's, one of the poorest regions, but because like the white working class is seen as reactionary, when they talk about wanting to change their diction and change their habits, as you said, Ruben, like they're saying like, oh, well, it's problematic to talk like this and like whatever, but they're not saying as like the working class. They're talking specifically about white working class people, and they're saying they're doing it for the benefit of Black people or immigrants or whoever, because in the United States, we really do only have, it's become very confused now because of the post 1960s like immigration bill, which allowed, lots of groups of non-white people which had never been in the United States in large numbers in. And so what you have now is a situation where you have these generations of Black people, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, who are really the only three non-white minorities who have been in this country for more than 100 years in any substantial numbers. And they're sort of being spoken for in the halls of academia by people who are not white, but also come oftentimes from this like post 1968 like waves of immigration from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, and it's mostly upper middle class people because that's the way our visa system is set up. It's extremely difficult. From like those parts of the world, the only immigrants that are coming are essentially refugees who 9 times out of 10 end up in like systemic poverty, or extremely wealthy, well-educated people who then, you have these situations where you have people who are Black claiming to speak on behalf of African Americans, which is a completely different culture than growing up the children that are like the child of Nigerian doctors. And so there's like this big divide where they're like, well, the Black people are offended by this. Black people are, it's like, no, you are, because you're an upper middle class person who went to Brown, or you went to Harvard or whatever. Like, they don't actually work alongside members of the Black working class or the Mexican American working class or any of these like historically like disenfranchised groups that they use the basis to build this sort of like Jay Sakai settlers-esque ideology of like, we have to remove the United States of anything that even slightly resembles historical racism before there can be like a socialist revolution that has to be led by the people who were disenfranchised by like the development of capitalism in the United States, which we are claiming to represent, but of whom which we don't actually descend from.
Yeah,
I mean, the guy who wrote Settlers was Japanese.
Yeah. There's a similar kind of thing happens in Australia, but it's less of a thing, I guess. But the thing about it that's really interesting is that working class is always conceptualized as white. People never think about the working class as what it is, which is it's actually, you have a very broad cross-section of all different types of people. It's not, And so there's like someone like the settlers people, like Sakai would probably say, oh, that's because of, you know, internalized white supremacy suffusing our culture. And so everyone just imagines particular groups as white. But no, I think there's something else going on there, because the people who talk about and produce discourse on working class people, it's almost like they're projecting. They're not, like, even if they're not white, they're projecting this idea of the working class, and not because they have no connection to it, they assume it's all one thing when it's not.
And as sort of like Orwell sort of points out here as well, which I feel like is probably the more, particularly today, it feels like even more relevant today than it probably did then, or maybe, I don't know, I didn't live in the 30s, but is that sort of desire for purity, which he talks about, which he also compares quite interestingly to Roman Catholicism, or particularly to converted Roman Catholics during this period, ends up driving away those people who are supposedly the ones who are going to benefit from the socialist revolution, or the ones who will incline towards like socialism to a certain degree, but are sort of just pushed out or pushed away from the movement. And you see this like happening in Australia in terms of like context here, like ever since John Howard, like particularly in the early 2000s, you know, the Howard's Battlers, which is really sort of the start of the working classes sort of movement more towards the right and more towards conservative parties, which sort of also begins with like Pauline Hanson and One Nation in terms of the more far right. But
Keating's like destruction of the union movement, or, you know, assimilation of the union into a small business.
Yeah, and it happens even like more today, right? The fact that like the Labour Party and the like Greens as well have completely lost their working class base, particularly in the and this is not, again, like to further your point, Matt, as well. This is not like a white working class issue either, although in parts of like Queensland it is. But the bigger issue for the Labor Party is they've lost the immigrant vote as well. They've lost the immigrant working class vote, particularly in like Western Sydney, and like other parts of Sydney like that, and in certain parts of Victoria as well. And they don't realize like how much they're going to lose this if they keep going the way they're going, which you can sort of see in America as well to a certain extent, like the way that Trump had pretty much a very large turnout from Hispanics as well.
Right.
And that'll probably keep increasing to a certain extent.
And not just like the sort of middle class Miami Cubans or whatever. It was South Texas. There was a county, I think, that's something 90-something% Mexican American, went from Hillary in 2016 to like voting for Donald Trump, like the whole county. And it's because people don't, especially people who don't grow up in like these border states, it's a really sort of high-minded professional class mindset of like putting people in groups that don't make sense. AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. What does that mean? What does someone from the Easter Islands and someone from Mongolia have in common? Nothing. Even like Latino, which is like somewhat useful, but I mean,
Latinx.
What does
Latinx,
right,
please get it right.
Latinx, yeah. What is someone from Argentina, like who's of like Italian descent, who immigrates to this country to work in a professional setting, and a Guatemalan who speaks like an Indian dialect as their first language? Like, what do those people have in common? Nothing. Maybe Catholicism, maybe, but that's really it. And a lot of Mexican American communities have been in South Texas forever. I know this because my family, like the shitty like couple of acres of farmland I grew up on, was granted to us by the Mexican government. They've been here, some of them for as long as my family has, and they many of them speak Spanish and whatever. Some of them don't, some of them do, but they don't see any connection between themselves and the immigrants from like Guatemala and Honduras and all that. They don't they don't see any like connection between them. Like they see those people as like coming to take their jobs in the Rio Grande Valley. Like that's what they see. And like, that's how you end up with, people, like the creator of the 1619 Project, for the Washington Post, tweeting things like Latinos aren't people of color or something, like saying like, after that like news came out, she was like, we really need to have a discussion about like which Latinos are people of color. And it's like, no, you want to have a conversation about like which Latino, like people of color in the United States has come to mean like people who support like the sort of liberal or quote unquote like left-wing agenda. It's very inconvenient when you find out that these people have their own cultures and they have their own motivations, both economic and otherwise. It comes as a very rude awakening to many leftists, I think, to find that the average working class person of color is not any more woke than a white working class person might be.
There is a fear that if you're working class, you have so little. There is a fear that you will lose it all if it all goes to shit. So there's that dynamic that I just don't think these middle class, what Orwell, I love this term, what Orwell calls bearded juice drinkers. And that's my favorite of his insults. I also like sandal wearing, what is it? Wearing shorts with fat bottoms and stuff.
Oh
like
my
that.
God, the scene where they come. I wish I had the quote up. Where they walk onto these two guys walk onto the bus, going to probably the socialist convention or something like that, and. All I can imagine is that you just said that they're wearing like incredibly tight, like khaki shorts or something like that.
And I'm just like, oh my God, he's reading me because I love shorts. But anyway, the point of that is that those sort of people, like the middle class sort of cranks, just do not understand that when you kind of propose these sort of kind of big ideas to sort of let's bring the system down, man. Working class people are going to be sus on that because.
And I think the key point as well, and I think this is a part that I was sort of like I pointed this out before I raised this issue earlier as well, but is that they want to. It's like Orwell sort of talks about here. Is his quote, and there is the outer suburban creeping Jesus, a hangover from the William Morris period. William Morris is actually quite good, but still the point still stands. So a hangover from the William Morris period is still surprisingly common, who goes about saying, why must we level down? Why not level up? And proposes to level the working class.
We can do both.
Proposes to level the working class up to his own standard by means of hygiene, fruit juice, birth control, poetry, etc.
Yeah.
I don't know. The fruit juice part is the best part about this.
Yeah. And
that's the whole like paternalism of like our modern age, is that, I mean, you can look at like every liberal project that's come out in the last couple of years, the most recent of which is like banning menthol cigarettes. Because like, I guess if you're like, it's always portrayed in a sort of way of like, we're on your side, like the tobacco companies are targeting you because you're like poor and black, which also I thought that was like a racist stereotype, but apparently like if you're a Democrat, you're just allowed to say like black people love Newports, like you're just allowed to say that. But like, I mean, they never bother to question why at the end of a long day your one sort of comfort that you can afford is a fucking cigarette. And like, this is unsolicited help. There is no great the great masses of underclass menthol smokers is not asking to have their solitary, like one single like joy in life taken away. It's being done for the good of them. It was the same thing with prohibition in the United States, of course. And it's not to say that smoking or that drinking doesn't cause a whole array of like health problems, and especially in the case of drinking, social problems. But they never bothered to address like the reasons why people become addicted to alcohol or drugs or cigarettes or anything like that.
They're all
there's also this great
my body, my choice for everyone else, but for working class people and black people, apparently it's like, oh no, this is for your own good, sort of thing, you know.
which has become, because they don't it's become almost taboo to acknowledge like the white working class and like liberal and at this point really leftist circles. So they use black and brown people as a sort of proxy for poverty. They'll say like this disproportionately affects, and if you look it up, it's all just traces on income. But because, and they'll say, you know, well, black and brown people are disproportionately poor. That's true. The majority of poor people in the United States are still white. So it's like they don't want to acknowledge class, so they use this sort of racialized proxy so that they can present what they're doing in racial term as like a sort of racial paternalism rather than a class paternalism. And I don't even know what the logic of that is. And I think it's just because of the way our political system works, or has worked. It's beginning to change, is that like, you know, you can kind of do that if you're in the Democratic Party or an adjacent organization like the DSA, and still expect that the majority of minorities will still vote for you. But I think that's going to change.
First of all, in this room, I see that no one's clapping for me. It could be because I'm not engaging, but it also is because everyone's doing this. And that's really important, because those loud bursts of noise, even though this is a noisy space, when we can do something like reducing that, that's really important. So please don't clap, shoot up these. And additionally with the noise issue, like avoid hissing, avoid waving banners, right? If you don't know what to do, show up these, right? I'm sure there's lots of ways that we can communicate to each other without needing to rely on something that's going to hurt somebody else. We have quiet rooms that are available. There's a range of options of these, right? On 7, there's one that has video but no sound, if you still want to be able to observe the convention, but the sound is an issue. There's also on Piedmont 8, a completely quiet room. One thing to note there, please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because that's going to be difficult for people.
I've been in environments, particularly if anyone's ever had the privilege of going to a slam poetry event or something like that, where it's like, you know, the clicking, it's where the clicking comes from, which I can't even click my fingers. Yeah. It's like, don't clap because it could be triggering. Yeah, that's where it comes from. And it's so you get clicking instead, which is much more sonally based. We're all, you know, end up being whales at some point. No voices at all, just sonar.
Well, you know, my position on that is, I think it's quite commonsensical, which is like, well, that's your problem, honey. So if you have a problem with that, just remove yourself from the space. Like, I feel like that is the compassionate position. No?
Yeah, I don't really have opinions on this. I'm just sort of like, I just don't care.
Like, as someone, like, if you've ever received a round of applause, it's very nice. And why should you not receive that because someone is triggered by it?
Well, it's a whole issue of like trying to solving problems for the smallest, for the minority, rather than solving for the majority, or like trying to solve it for everyone. Which, of course, like, you know, I don't mean that in like a utilitarian sense. You know, like just get anyone who, like, you know, smallly doesn't, like, you know, try to doesn't conform, we should get rid of. Definitely not saying that. That could be taken out of context. But that, you know, you should have to, like, most of the time you have like universal rules, right? You know, it's like the free speech issue, right? You can't have you have to give free speech to everyone, or you can't give it to anyone at all. You don't make exceptions for individuals or for small parts. You have to like create more universal laws.
I've never met anyone in real life who is like afraid of people clapping. And I feel like, I don't know, like, and now I'm getting like a little tipsy, so I can just like really let it out. This is the problem when we emptied the asylums or institute, whatever you want to call them, when we just like let these people loose on the street because the state was like, oh, well, the conditions are so bad. Like, the compassionate thing is just to let these crazy people out on the streets. So we don't have to deal with them anymore. And that's the compassionate response. Like, this is what we end up with. We end up with a society where you can't fucking clap. It's insane.
But it's also
You can clap in
like,
emoji form though. Like,
you are
Yeah.
a menace. If you are afraid of clapping, you are a menace.
But what's like I think funny about a lot of these things, and it's the same with I feel like it's the same with like a lot of this sort of it's all generated through like social media more often than not, and the way that social media works in terms of like reactions and stuff. That so many of these things just don't actually exist in reality, but because of social media's like amplifications, like that, you know, you'll get a conservative pundit or whoever who's like a very bad faith culture warrior who heightens the issue to something that's like should be considered like a mainstream cultural problem. It's like, well, in reality, these things don't actually exist that much. But then you also get like other people who are like, well, maybe they do exist. So then they have to like they correct for it themselves. So they start to like internalize these things, and when in reality, like nothing actually exists or nothing really. Yeah, it's really weird in the way that it sort of like plays out in reality versus the way that it sort of plays out on social media.
Yeah,
Well-
and I mean, if you were like truly triggered by like loud noises or like people clapping, there's so much louder noises that you just encounter in everyday life. Like there's probably like a small handful of people are truly like that, but those people aren't at the fucking DSA convention because those people cannot leave their homes. Like, you know, like
also,
Yeah,
what,
this is-
they always
read
claim.
online.
Yeah, they
and
always
they're-
claim it's like PTSD, and it's like, what are you, a Vietnam vet or something? Like, what PTSD did you get that clapping is an issue?
Like they got into a screaming match with their dad at the end of the cul-de-sac. Like that's their trauma.
The dad clapped.
These people, yeah, like their dad like sarcastically
Go to
clapped
your
at them.
room.
Yeah, go to your room, and now they're triggered. Yeah, I think that's the origin of it. Maybe, I don't know.
Anyway, along these same lines, I want to pivot, to use a very middle class term, to River's piece for Twinkware, which was fantastic. It's called The Standpoint Bureaucracy. And what I wanted to ask about this actually is that had you read Road to Wigan Pier before this? Because I find there's so much like there are a lot of
No, I
connections.
hadn't.
And yeah, do you want to take us through it?
Is this your first reading?
Mine?
Yeah, it is. Well, it's my of Wiggle.
Sorry.
Wiggle. Shit. No, that's like Chet Hanks's autobiography. The Road to Wigan Pier. Yeah, I had never read this before Matt invited me on, and so I like got a copy and read it, but I hadn't read it before. Yeah, so the Standpoint Bureaucracy is it's a term that I coined. I guess you could say.
You've really made it now.
We should clap for that.
Yeah.
It basically refers to this system of people leveraging identities which might be real or fictitious or exaggerated in order to advance themselves within a system of power. Like the Standpoint Bureaucracy is this sort of overarching circle that exists certainly in academia, in left-wing organizations like the DSA, which I opened by recounting that infamous convention, and increasingly like in corporate America to a certain extent. And it's a way that you can claim to be a representative of one sort of quote unquote marginalized group or the other. Because, and we kind of got into this earlier, this sort of mode in at least in America, and I think it's spreading, unfortunately, for the rest of you, is that it's no longer, the contradiction in society is no longer one of class, it's one of identity. It's, there's this fictitious idea in America, which may have had some resonance under like Jim Crow or something, but certainly doesn't matter today, that your position in society is determined by a number of factors, the preeminent one being race, but also gender, sexual orientation, disability or ability, I guess, and so forth and so on.
What I found like particularly interesting about the piece is the way that you focus in on the bureaucratic part of it, because it is bureaucratic, right? And the way in which the language is turned into sort of jargon, the way that the language is turned into it's almost like, a really faux, like dodgy census, right? Where you tick the right boxes, you ascend through the hierarchy and all these kinds of things. But it never actually feels like properly representative. It's representative in the sense that, you can find a particular number, or you can find a particular, the correct word that becomes representative without actually being representative. You kind of even find this in Orwell as well when he's talking about the sort of middle-class socialist or like working-class intelligentsia who get sucked into literary culture, as he says, and then like get spat back out, and will end up becoming like elected to be the trade union representative. But then, of course, like all I really see that is the end is a promotion or a way to get up in the hierarchy without actually coming back to represent the workers anymore. I think we're seeing like that, but like in en masse and in ways that sort of just mean that the class distinction or the emphasis on the working class becomes even more or even less emphasized.
And it's become, right, exactly. And it's become also a way of, the more sort of quote unquote marginalized identities that you can stack on, the better. And this creates an incentive structure to where, as we saw with the DSA meeting with the people that don't clip or like whatever, calling yourself disabled, whatever that might mean. It could mean you have ADHD. It could mean that you have like autism, which is almost always with these people either self-diagnosed or if actually diagnosed with a doctor, seemingly very well, like high functioning. People also embracing various sexual and gender identities, which may or may not asexual, right? Or people.
No, I said fray sexual. Have you heard of that one?
Sexual, yeah. Or people, saying that they're like bisexual or pansexual when there's like no evidence that that's true, but it's biphobic or whatever. To be like, well, you're with a man, you've been exclusively with men, and you're a woman, so that kind of doesn't make sense. Or the non-binary thing has really just been a gold mine for these people, because you're not really, it doesn't really mean anything. Like it doesn't, like you don't actually have to present in a way that is non-conforming to the gender binary in any way. You can, if you were born a man, you can identify as non-binary but still look completely like a man. But then you are able to speak for trans people, including trans people who actually transition, which seems like nonsense, but here we are.
It's so fun.
And it's a market incentive, because it's a way for people to advance their careers and accumulate social capital at the very least, as with like the DSA, or in academia and in the corporate world, actual capital, and the NGOs too as well.
And it's also it's always sold as like a personal idea, so it's uncritiquable in the eyes of the market, because you're like, this isn't a market idea. This is who I am. The idea, this kind of like capitalist idea of gender, this easily subsumable, marketable idea of gender. I can buy my caste gender flag, and then be part of a group.
What that is.
But I think there's a strange put my Marxist hat on for a second, even though I'm many things in it. I'm not a Marxist.
No,
I know, very very dirty of me, being the one actual capitalist here. but this is sort of like maybe an idea here that this is like, you know, the logical high point of neoliberal culture, where we all become atomized, or we all become sort of, you know, the main market in a neoliberal culture is the individual. You know, what Foucault would call, you know, got to get some Foucault references in, you know, homo economicus. I always forget. I always can't pronounce it. But, you know, that the idea that the individual is the main marketable quality, the individual is the capital, and that's the main thing. And that just seems to be more and more stratified here. So, you know, you have to, I guess what usually is called creative capital. Sarah Brulette is an academic who writes particularly well on this, where they've sort of like taken over sort of the creative classes as well, and the creative capital, where what you have to do is like you present your identity as a marketable part of your character, and that comes down to what you were talking about, River, in terms of like incentive structures, and because it has to do with like what's incentivized, and you know, we live in an age of social media where, you know, we're all encouraged to sell ourselves in a certain way. We're all encouraged to, you know, create our pages or do what we have to do. You know, create our own podcasts because all of our voices should be heard, which of course they should be, and you should download our podcast today.
Listen to this podcast.
Exactly.
We also have a narcissistic culture, bringing the Lashian reference, and also a confessional culture.
Beat me to it.
Yeah.
You beat me to the Lash.
A confessional culture, and like, I mean, I know Lash was talking about this in the 70s, but I really blame it on Oprah. Well, she did. I mean, she would bring these people onto her shows. She would, you know, get these people to reveal their like deepest secrets and like deepest like the inner workings of their mind. And when she was doing it in like her heyday in the 90s, it was almost like a freak show. Like it was almost like it was for the spectacle of it all. It was for bored housewives to watch. But now it's become virtuous to become this sort of exhibitionist. And just people know your inner thoughts and your inner things. And more directly to the non-binary thing, like gender, we're told two things. We're told that gender is a social construct. By definition, that almost seems to mean that it would be constructed by other people. But then there's also, because we do live in such an individualist, narcissistic culture, it becomes something that's self-constructed. That like, it's not gender isn't constructed by the society. Gender is what I decided to be, and my gender is what you know what I mean. It's what I decided to be, which is, you know, the older model of like transgenderism, where you actually transition made more sense because people would perceive you as a man or a woman or whatever, or if you just like didn't look, you know, the truly like non-binary, where it's like people, the androgyny, like where people couldn't quite tell, like you didn't fit into the social conventions of like what people would perceive a man or a woman as. That was still like coming from the society. It wasn't coming from something internal, because nobody feels like completely like a man or a woman, especially if you're gay. And it's
well, the thing that's interesting is that a lot of conservatives and like crazy conservatives essentially keep sort of pointing to these old ideas that were sort of around in postmodern theory, but it's different because it's not like, because what the postmodern theorists said, especially the queer theorists and all that sort of stuff, is that they were very much about contingency, that an identity is not something that is essentialized. It cannot be, it's not a being, it's a doing. But what's happened now is it's shift to this idea that they've taken like, essentially a la carte, taken the queer theory stuff and been like, this is what I identify as, without realizing that the kind of thought behind that, whatever you think of it, doesn't actually say that. It doesn't say that you can identify as whatever you want. Identity is this thing that you create. It's not about being, it's about doing. Like the whole idea behind Foucault's history of sexuality is that the kind of homosexual was invented, because previously it wasn't a thing. It was just a thing that men did. It wasn't an identity. It became pathologized and turned into a state of being. Whereas now people have almost like taken that idea from Foucault and not realized that that's a critique.
And it comes back to Oprah as well.
Everything does.
Everything comes back to Oprah, but I think Oprah's, and I take the point, but Oprah's only a symptom of something that's much broader, and that it is, since the advent of television in particular as a medium, and particularly as the major cultural medium, which is sort of, it's become more to do with the internet now, but the internet is really just sort of a larger sort of version of that to a certain degree, is that we live in a visual culture and things have to be visualized, things have to be presented within the world. So like, as you said, it has to be like, you could see something as becoming being as something that has to be like visualized. It has to have form. It has to have something that's perceivable. It has to have something that has reality in the world rather than something that's just internally felt. It has to be named. It has to be categorized to a certain degree. Otherwise, it doesn't have life. And that comes, I think, one of the main reasons why this has become such a big thing today is because we live in a visual culture. We live in a world where if something can't be presented on television or something like that, it doesn't exist. And of course, that's become a sort of a weird postmodern cliched sort of idea to say, but it has some like fundamental truth into it, even if it doesn't literally mean that it has to be on television, right? It has to be visualized. It has to be turned into an image of some kind for it to exist. And that leaves us in a sort of a very weird cultural perspective, particularly when it comes to language, and particularly when it comes to trying to turn the world back into language. Because this is because it's like, a very kind of like bizarre conservative misinterpretation of postmodernism. But the whole idea that everything, the whole world is created of the whole world is language, right? That's the sort of general conservative understanding of postmodernism, and that means like language is being, and language is completely reflective or mimetic or something like that. What you say is what you become. That's the sort of general thing. But that again is a visual idea of language. That's an idea that language must be completely reflective of life, and therefore the language we use must be internally consistent, even when it's not. Like, language is chaos. Language is not literal. Language is figuration, and I think that's one of the reasons, to maybe segue into talking a little bit more about Orwell again, to get my point in about socialist literature being bad. But is kind of the point, right? You can't have what is the Orwell idea? You can't write good art under socialism. You can't write good art in a world that believes language should be literal, because all great art is chaotic. All great art is figurative, and it emerges because of that.
Also, too, like, they're more kind of to the point of like my essay, and it also relates back to Orwell when he's talking about like the proletarian and intelligentsia, which, like, I guess I'm kind of a representative of, and maybe you guys are too. I can't speak for you, but like, my parents do not give a fuck about any of this. They don't know who Foucault is. They don't. None of this matters to them. All of this gender discourse, it doesn't matter to the vast majority of working class people. It's irrelevant. And like, that was kind of like the entire point of like the essay, is like, these identitarian concerns are largely do not matter to the working class, and they're being used in this sort of weird insular way by like the upper classes to like get ahead. And I think maybe because like this sort of identitarianism hadn't quite emerged yet, Orwell doesn't really directly talk about that, but I think he would have been a keen observer of it today.
But he does talk about the way in which, like, one of the issues for socialists and communists at the time is because they speak in a sort of really weird technical jargon that is like far, as he says, like, as the technical jargon of the communists, it is far removed from the common speech. It's the language of a mathematical textbook, and that drives people, as he said, it drives people away from the communist movement or from the socialist movement, who otherwise probably would actually agree with the ideas. But because of the way that it's presented in terms of a language that is alienated from the stuff of everyday life, they're talking about ideology, talking about whatever the other technical terms are.
Exact same quote highlighted.
It ends up like, just driving them away from what they would want to believe, which is of course not what this this podcast being is a very classical capitalist podcast.
No, it's not.
Would never endorse.
I think you'll be happy to know, Ruben. I think you'll be happy to know that like actually most of the people who are fans of my writing are not actually communists or don't identify.
Oh well, I'd
they're
hope
not.
If they did identify as a communist, we'd have a few problems, wouldn't we?
I'm reviled really by most of the left. I mean, like especially this last article that came out. I mean, I had like blue check journalists coming after me. I mean, like the only book that one of my articles has ever been cited in has like a fucking blurb on it by Alan Dershowitz.
God, you've really made it. Oh my God.
I have more conservative fans, I think, than liberal fans, even though I mean, it's very clear that it's a Marxist site, that I'm a Marxist. I think it actually says, because they didn't want to say Twink Revolution and in print. I think they said, writing for a small Marxist publication. Yeah, I mean,
small, slender, hairless Marxist publication.
Just fuck men.
I wanted to actually just maybe to bring this around in terms of what your piece does, River, and what has sort of happened, since Orwell, is that the main shift that I think has happened is very interesting, and this is where I'm bringing the lash in, but you sort of preempted me, is this idea of a therapeutic culture that sort of like trickles down into everything, including politics, like this idea that, Lash talks about this. I won't kind of go into the quote. It's in Culture of Narcissism. And he essentially says that we live in a culture now, we don't have religion as a major force anymore. And kind of a therapeutic kind of sensibility has sort of usurped that. And that you can see in Oprah, even though, as River says, Oprah did start out it was the spectacle of it. But the whole idea of the therapeutic culture there is really interesting. And we really see this everywhere. People talk about art as therapy. What's that fucking, is it fucking, Alain de Botton, The School of Life, where the way that they justify art is essentially that it's a form of therapy.
Well, that goes back to Aristotle as well. Right? This has been around for a long time.
Yeah, it has, but like I'm just saying that there's more of that within the culture, and I think art, literature, music as therapy, sort of these things to sort of soothe your soul and whatever your mental illness is, and I think that flows down into politics as well. And this is why you have these people in the standpoint bureaucracy being able to leverage their mental illnesses or whatever the hell is going on with them in terms of this sort of therapeutic politics. I think that's the major difference between Orwell and now, right?
Well, I think maybe, and I probably should just write an entire 12-page article about how Oprah is to blame for all of our social ills. But I do think that the reason what Oprah did, because there were earlier sort of daytime like TV shows which were this sort of like spectacle and whatever. What Oprah did was made the spectacle acceptable to the educated classes. Because she would have these people, and it was a spectacle. It was like a freak show, but it was a freak show with a heart. It was like a freak show where she would get these people to reveal their deepest, darkest traumas and concern and whatever, and then she would try to comfort them. So it was much nicer than the sort of Jerry Springer, just look at these like white trash people. They don't even know who the father of their kid is, and she turned that into something that seemed empathetic. And so now, but that was, I think, internalized in the popular culture as, it's not, it's therapeutic to talk about these things in a very public forum, and it's liberating, because that's what the educated classes got from Oprah. the lower classes were there for the show. They were there for the drama, the suspense of like what happened to this person. Like, you know, you escaped a cult, you were like raped repeatedly and held in a basement. Like, you know, it was more along those lines. It was a real live TV drama. But for, I think, the educated classes, it was more of they internalized it as like something that this sort of exhibitionism as a form of liberation. And that eventually, not only did it become a form of liberation, but a form of personal advancement, which is how you come to like the standpoint bureaucracy.
Yeah. Culture of narcissism, baby.
If we want to defeat capitalism, we are going to need a party that will organize working people to fight for the demands that we want and to win socialism. Thank you so much.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.